Good afternoon. Welcome to the Library of Congress. My name is Andrew Briner. I'm with the John W. Kluge Center, and I'm very pleased to be sitting here today with Tamika Nunley. Tamika Nunley is in residence here as Carrie and Anne McGuire Chair in Ethics and American History. She's Associate Professor of History and Sandler Family Faculty Fellow at Cornell University. Today we're discussing Tamika's newest book, The Demands of Justice: Enslaved Women, Capital Crime, and Clemency in Early Virginia. Her first book, At the Threshold of Liberty: Women, Slavery, and Shifting Identities in Washington, D.C., looked at the ways that African American women navigated slavery, social and legal restrictions, and the massive changes the 19th century would bring. Nunley was interviewed by the Kluge Center's interim director, Brent Iacobucci, on that book, and we're very happy to have her back. So I'd like to start things off by asking, how did researching and writing your previous book, At the Threshold of Liberty, lead you towards writing this book, The Demands of Justice?
You know, it's interesting. At the Threshold of Liberty really tried to capture Black women's experiences in the nation's capital across identities. A lot of the scholarship had focused maybe exclusively on the history of slavery, or on freedom, or on the Civil War, or on the nation's founding. And what I wanted to capture was all the ways in which Black women's identities were quite complex, whether they were enslaved or free or criminalized. And so that criminalized piece really sort of became a topic that I was interested in expanding upon, because there was quite an interesting source base in the Virginia archives that captured the ways that Black women would become entangled in the law. And that would not be the only ways in which society would view these women, and certainly wouldn't be the only ways in which they would view themselves. And so this lens of criminality actually opened up a whole new sort of vein of inquiry that allowed me to explore all the ways in which they've encountered the nation's laws, and all the ways in which the nation's laws were also designed to really circumscribe their lives and position them in a particular place in society.
Yeah, and so in the newest book, you focus in the subtitle, in fact, on capital crime, enslaved women, and particularly on cases of clemency. So what was it, I mean, even going off of that answer, what about clemency specifically drew you to this topic?
You know, when we think about clemency, we think about someone who is now sort of deemed innocent by the executive office and no longer sort of attached to this idea of being a criminal. Whereas clemency in the 19th century really focused on sort of creating a sense of even-handedness when it came to managing enslaved women who are accused of capital crime. And so I actually wanted to get away more so from the systemic level of how Black women were being identified, and really begin to center their experiences and actually what they did. And when I began to look at what they did, what they were accused of, and the worlds in which they lived, I realized that they were actually conveying ideas about justice that we don't oftentimes associate with people who are deemed criminals in the United States. And so I wanted to get away from identifying them solely through the lens of the crime that they were accused of, and began to sort of center them as women who had ideas, who had experiences, and sometimes crime was the only form of recourse that they had.
Yeah, and then another element of the title, you discuss capital crimes specifically, and in the book you structure it around poisoning, murder, infanticide, and insurgency. Why was that sort of a structuring element for you?
When we think about these kinds of crimes, they almost represent sort of the worst of the kinds of crimes that you could commit. And I was less interested in thinking, oh, these women were very violent. I was more so very much interested in this idea of they were sort of brought to this moment in which they felt like they could no longer survive what it is that they were subjected to. And then in other instances, their actions were more calculated and they were intentionally violent, right? And we have a fellow here, Aaron Shearer, who works on this work as well, and I'm excited about seeing this work come out. But this is really important to think about as well, that sometimes Black women are plotting against enslavers who had treated them to years and years of cruelty. And this was the only recourse that they had. And so I thought that these capital crimes, in a lot of ways, opened up all sorts of questions about what would lead an enslaved woman to attempt to poison her enslaver, what would lead her to try to murder them, right? What were the conditions on the ground that caused them to engage in this sort of behavior? And it says more actually about the society that they lived in, the enslavers, right, that had legal authority over them, than it did about them, right?
That makes sense. And turning to one of the specific topics, and as with many, a difficult topic, one of your chapters is about infanticide. These are some of the most disturbing elements of slavery and the horribly constrained choices enslaved women faced. These women are dealing with prevalent sexual violence and pregnancy perpetrated by their enslavers, and the resulting children face the same future, serving as a reminder of their lack of power and choice. And then the element of the reproductive labor that you discuss in the book being an essential element to the continued existence of slavery. So what do you make of the decision on the part of these women to, in some cases, end the lives of their own children? What sort of considerations are they facing, and what does it mean to them?
Mm-hmm. When we think about inheritance today, we think about particularly fathers passing down some sort of personal identity or inheritance. Sorry, that's my daughter. And what's interesting about that is that that English common law tradition of passing down inheritance through the father is actually altered through state statutes in colonial Virginia to make slavery inheritable through the wombs, through the reproductive labor of enslaved women. So what this means then is that the decision or being even forced, right, to have children is something that Black women in particular had to grapple with and grappled with on a variety of levels. Some embraced the idea of bearing children, but many were very conflicted by the idea of bearing children in a system that would continue to subject them to slavery, right, for the rest of their lives. And so what's interesting about these stories of infanticide in this book is that a lot of these enslaved women who are accused of infanticide are actually killing daughters, right? And you know, in a lot of ways, many of these women understand what the future holds for these little girls, right? That the numbers, their years are numbered in terms of the degree of childhood that they will have access to. Historians have referred to this as prematurely knowing evil things, right? Having to be subjected to sexual violence and to sort of a hyper maturing and adultification of little girls in the system of slavery. And so the decision on the surface, when you're looking at newspapers from 19th century Virginia, will say, oh, this mother, you know, cruelly murdered her child. But if you look at it from the lens of the enslaved mother, she may not have seen it that way. She actually may have seen it in the context of her rescuing her daughter from a future that was going to be filled with violence and brutality. And Toni Morrison has captured this in really in sort of an incredible way through Beloved, right? Using the case of Margaret Garner as an example of how enslaved mothers grappled and wrestled with the reality of bearing children under the system of chattel slavery. But what the chapter in my book shows is that actually Margaret Garner wasn't alone. She wasn't an exception, that actually quite a few enslaved mothers wrestled with that decision in ways that lead to infanticide.
Right. And then what role does the legal response to these infanticides play in really upholding the system of slavery, and then also the clemency that sometimes resulted in these cases?
Absolutely. So when we think about clemency, you would think that, okay, they're free of charge, then what happens next? Well, in the system of slavery, the best possible outcome is for an enslaved woman to be sold to the Deep South outside of Virginia, or to return to her enslaver. And so if that's the technology of clemency under the system of slavery, then what is justice under such a system, right? If they know that there are unusual circumstances that have led this woman to engage in this behavior, then what is justice under a system that will continue to subject her to the system of slavery and to the very conditions that led her to the action to begin with? And that is, right, what I wrestle with, right, is if this is the origin story of our American legal system and how we brand justice, then what is sort of the legal scaffolding that has to be undone for us to realize a more fuller picture of justice? And so I think that the stories of these women help us to begin to grapple and wrestle with that, mainly because even today, in states like Virginia, judges are still creating opinions, crafting opinions using slave statutes because they haven't been repealed. So this is not some sort of phenomenon that we're making up or some connections that we're trying to force, that they're actually quite present and real with us. And so in many of these cases, petitioners, local community members will submit a petition and say that this woman shouldn't be executed, that she should be granted clemency. Because there are sort of extenuating circumstances that haven't been accounted for in the trial record. And this becomes interesting because the governor of the state has the power to grant clemency, and oftentimes when these petitions have been submitted, they will grant clemency, but the clemency, as we mentioned before, right, is being sold to the Deep South to another enslaver. And that enslaver is actually going to be aware of why they're being sold. They're going to know that this enslaved woman is being charged with a crime. So if this person knows that this woman has been charged with a crime and for being violent, right, then chances are her experiences are going to be quite brutal when she's sold to the South in order to check that behavior. And so this feature of clemency then has been treated by historians as a way to understand early American judges and their preoccupations with justice. A lot of historians have used the examples of clemency to say that, see, the United States in its early inceptions were very much concerned with issues of justice, and that these cases did not automatically end in execution, and therefore, right, it complicates our assumptions about what happens to these women. But I take it a step further to say that even as jurists are preoccupied with the notion of justice, they don't get to define its scope, right? That actually Black women are engaging in violent behavior because they're saying that the system is not enough, right? That benevolent feature, the quote unquote benevolent feature of clemency, is insufficient for the justice that they seek. And so the question I pose in this work is, what happens when we take seriously the claims of enslaved women who decide that they'd rather be dead, that they'd rather be sold than to continue to be subjected to the system of chattel slavery? What do we do with that? And how do we take that seriously as sort of an intellectual tradition of justice as well?
Yeah, and the ways in which these conceptions of justice might align better with our conceptions of justice today, or do in pretty much all cases, than what was actually enacted as justice at the time.
Absolutely.
And I'm curious for one thing, about these local petitioners that appear frequently in the book, people from the surrounding community who petition for clemency in these cases. But I think it's right to not think that these people were abolitionists. They weren't necessarily objecting to slavery as a system, but what was motivating them?
What I've learned is that in Virginia, local communities and counties, and I've actually lived in Virginia and witnessed this for myself, that local counties very much care about how the county, how the town is being perceived. And when they see somebody not adhering to norms of Southern honor, right, they oftentimes will speak out, right? And so the idea of sexual violence is not new to people in the South. They understand that this happens. They understand that the law allows it. But there are some ways in which some of these enslavers were so blatant in their brutality and their cruelty toward the enslaved in front of members of the community, in front of those who were citizens of the town, that those enslavers offended local sensibilities. And because of that, they wanted it to at least be on the record that they did not agree that a woman should be sentenced to the death penalty as a result. But they did see sale to the South as a more benevolent alternative to that. And I argue that enslaved women didn't see sale and transportation as benevolent, right?
Right.
And so there are competing ideas about what is right, what is wrong, what is just, what is benevolent.
Yeah, and I'm curious about the ways that that concept of benevolence or that certain slave owners went too far served to cover up the more everyday realities of violence and sexual violence and children fathered by these slave owners. Was that a major part of their sort of policing of when sort of justice went too far?
Absolutely. It's a delicate balance, right? Because by the time you get to the 1850s, the decade leading up to the American Civil War, what you see is people sort of making this argument that slavery is a positive good, that Black people need masters, that they need the oversight of a ruling class. And if that ruling class proves to be unable to manage their passions, to manage their temper, to manage the enslaved and their dependents in that household, then they are very much complicating that narrative of slavery as a positive good, right? And so it's a delicate dance, even as they understand that this level of violence is permitted legally.
Occurring regularly.
Right, regularly. And the authority of the enslaver to do what they will, right, with enslaved people who are considered legal property is encoded in the law and protected by it, right?
Right. Yeah, so I'm going to turn to one of your examples now from the chapter where you focus on poisonings. You describe Phyllis, a young enslaved girl accused of poisoning a child in 1852, the son of her enslavers, who are Patrick and Ann Butler. And in the Butler's eyes, Phyllis has already been insolent and defiant, was harsh towards the child, and she was previously punished through physical violence and imprisonment. And there was no question to these slave owners that Phyllis should face the maximum punishment of death. The court found her guilty, but commuted her sentence from death to being sold further south, which was considered, as you said, to be a more humane sentence to the courts. And this was in consideration of Phyllis's young age. And I think this case illuminates a lot of the points you're making in the book, and one that maybe stands out to those who are listening. As we've kind of discussed, the idea that sale into continued slavery would be seen by the white populace as clemency, and that the most that sort of a Black woman could expect in this case was, she was not going to get out of slavery as a result, but that, being sold further south was even often discussed as a pretty major punishment in other contexts, right? And so can you give me an outline of the legal system that enslaved people faced overall when accused of a capital crime, and what hope they could possibly have for the outcome, though? We've talked a little bit about that.
Absolutely. I mean, the legal system is interesting because we take this for granted when we think about slavery and the history of slavery, but the laws were different for people who were enslaved. They were different for people who were free Black people, right, who are indigenous people. And so what would be considered as a crime, right, is very racialized, right? So say, for instance, in D.C., right, in the 19th century, it was illegal for Black people to fly a kite, right? And these are sort of the everyday things that we sort of take for granted, but that's the beginnings. That's the beginning scaffolding of the nation's laws, that it's heavily racialized, it's heavily gendered, right? Enslaved women are performing this reproductive labor, and now all of these children are enslaved as a result of her status, right? And so that has been a result of the scaffolding of the law. In addition to that, in the state of Virginia, if an enslaved woman was executed, then the enslaver would actually be compensated by the state coffers to compensate for the loss of the value of that enslaved woman, right? And so his or her economic investment continues to be protected no matter what happens to that enslaved woman, right? And so if she's sold further to the south, right, as an act of clemency, the enslaver is going to get compensated as a result. If she's executed, she's going to be compensated. He's going to be compensated, right? If she remains enslaved, that enslaver will continue to profit off of the labor of that enslaved woman or girl, right? And so that economic interest in slavery, right, as an engine of economic growth, of asset building for these individuals, right, is something that the laws were structured around, right? And so if that's part of the legal origin stories of the nation, then what is the work that has to be done to begin to unravel all of that?
Right, and you describe in the book, I believe, that in Virginia, no Black person could testify as a witness in these cases. Is that right?
Yes, so enslaved witnesses might be called upon, but they could not testify against an enslaver.
I see.
So they could testify against an enslaved person or a Black person, but not the enslaver, right? And so if that's the case, right, how do you get witness testimony that vouches for what the enslaved person might have experienced, right? And that's really, right, that's the foundations.
Right, and I think you describe in the book maybe a couple cases of acquittal, but in most cases it seems like the result was kind of a foregone conclusion for that and other reasons, right?
Absolutely, and even when we talk about acquittal, what's acquittal, right? So where does she go when she leaves the courtroom? Right? She's going back to where she came from.
Yeah. And then going back to the case of Phyllis, one of the tensions you explore in the book is the sort of the tension of intimacy. At one time, this enslaved woman is taking care of these intimate family matters, taking care of this small child, but at the same time, this family clearly distrusts her and sees her as potentially a problem in the household. And this was something that happened throughout the system of slavery. How did enslaved people sort of navigate this tension, and how did it come out in these capital crime cases?
They managed it very strategically, right? And so in order to serve food, you have to trust the person that's serving you food. In order to receive medicine, you have to trust the person who's administering that medicine. And enslaved women and girls built a knowledge around botanical properties, around healing practices, around culinary practices that have sort of fundamentally shaped the nation and how we understand, those respective disciplines. And so I also treat these women as holding certain intellectual ideas around how we know what we know about how to be healed, how we know about what we know about Southern cuisine, right? What we know about caring for children, what we know about being midwives and about their reproductive lives. And so they're this wellspring of knowledge as well. And this knowledge gets passed down through the generations as a result. And in a lot of ways, enslavers are forced oftentimes to defer to that knowledge and actually be checked by that knowledge. And so I'll give you an anecdote that is probably one of the most illuminating for me for that chapter. At one point, an enslaver accused a man and a woman of trying to poison him. And during the testimony, it came out that the enslaved man said, I wanted to get a poison or get some concoction to make the enslaver love me because he kept beating me, right? And then the enslaved woman was just like, I'm just trying to take him out, right? And so they go to this elderly woman named Lovelace. And Lovelace is this elderly woman who gives them a little bit of this, a little bit of that, some hair, a little shard of glass, a little sprinkle of this, right? And then the enslaver sees it in the man's pocket and is like, you're trying to poison me, right? And so those two actually are charged, right, for attempted poison. And I believe that they were granted clemency. And then someone asked, well, is somebody gonna get Lovelace? And the enslaver was like, I'm all set. Like, we're not gonna mess with Lovelace. Like, Lovelace is an elder, and she has powers, and we don't want to mess with any of that,
Wow.
right?
Yeah.
And so I thought that that case was so illuminating, A, because it kind of made me chuckle, and I needed a chuckle in
Yeah,
this book,
right.
right? But it was a really great reminder that our assumptions that we bring to the study of slavery and how we understand the power dynamics of slavery are so complicated by the one-on-one experience with these people.
Right.
And sometimes people have social currency that we don't always account for, or we're not able to account for because of the limitations of the sources. But in that case, I found that she had a tremendous amount of social currency, that she was seen as a healer, as someone with powers, and as someone who could impact the circumstances of her peers. And in that sense, I thought that that was very powerful. And it showed sort of the social economy on the ground
Right.
that we may not always see in the court.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And even in I guess, more day-to-day cases where in some of these cases someone might be accused of poisoning, but was also entrusted to give this same medicine that could be a poison in a large dose, or it could be therapeutic in a small dose. This combination of reliance and distrust and suspicion just seems like a very complex, I don't know.
It's a blurry line. I
Yeah.
mean, I don't think any of us would ever want to see a doctor from the 19th century,
Right.
You know, that was the era of heroic medicine, right?
Right.
And so oftentimes even enslavers would prefer to receive healing practices from the enslaved and actually from women in the community, because people looked at doctors very suspiciously, right?
Right.
And it was a blurry line because there could be a medicine that was used to calm a baby, but as you said, in a dosage that was incorrect, it could actually lead to their death, or it could lead to them becoming sick.
Right.
And so oftentimes, that sort of expert witness testimony was not sort of a fully developed practice in the early legal system just yet, because the early American medical system was not fully developed
Right.
at that point.
And it seems like a lot of room to sort of impute an attempt at poisoning to something that could have been an incorrect dosage, or even just a strange reaction, or a surprising, or even a normal reaction to something that we would not give a child today, or something like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And going back to the case of Phyllis a little bit more, you describe her enslavers as having sent her to jail as part of their attempts to previously discipline her. And you describe this as sort of a breakdown of the way that the discipline system was supposed to work in this system. What did that mean that they sent her to a jail rather than sort of performing violent discipline within the home?
So enslavers, right, had the legal protection to be able to discipline, in quotation marks, right, that could be taken any kind of way, enslaved people on their property. Enslaved people were considered their legal property. And so it was sort of understood that if you're an enslaver, that you manage the behavior of the enslaved who are under your charge, because people were terrified of rebellion, of enslaved people retaliating. And so this idea that if you've lost control under your household, you know, people really judged you for that, right, and scrutinized what was going on in your home.
Right.
In a place like Richmond, where Phyllis was, there were already slave pens and jails that housed enslaved people on their way to the Deep South for sale. And oftentimes, these would be torture chambers. These would be places where you did not want to go. And in Richmond in particular, there were a couple of establishments, slave marts, slave pens, that specialized particularly in brutalizing young girls in preparation for being sold into prostitution in New Orleans. And so Richmond became an important depot for that. And so sending Phyllis there was to kind of teach her a lesson, so to speak, about what her life could look like if she did not correct her behavior. And so it just goes to show sort of the broader slave economy, what enslavers could could leverage and what they could access, the technologies of abuse, the technologies of brutality that they called upon in order to keep their behavior in check.
And looking ahead to your chapter on insurgency, which is a more sort of concerted effort to fight the enslaver in some sense, what was the significance of Phyllis's case taking place in 1852 or any sort of capital crime case around that time? How were things changing? How was the sort of crisis over slavery or abolition in the US sort of, the Civil War would happen less than a decade later? How is that changing these cases?
I think in the 1850s, you began to see politicians really paying attention, particularly in the Virginia state legislature, paying attention to cases involving enslaved resistance out of concern for whether or not the state was going to really back up enslavers, right? Because the South is concerned that there's not going to be enough federal protection of the status of slavery in the nation. But an enslaved woman like Phyllis would not have, an enslaved girl like Phyllis would not have been privy necessarily to sort of the mounting political tensions in that way. But by the time we do get to the war, enslaved women and girls are absolutely aware of the Confederacy unraveling, and they play their part in that insurgent effort, right? And they're very clear, like, this is a possibility that that we could escape, that we can take the society down itself, right? And this is not new, right? During the American Revolution, during the War of 1812, particularly in Virginia, enslaved people catch wind that there is chaos, that there is war, and they take advantage of it, and they do all sorts of things to undermine enslavers. And so the Civil War is certainly no exception.
Yeah, and can you tell me any specifics about ways that enslaved women in Virginia did respond to news of the Civil War's progress?
Absolutely. There's one story of an enslaved woman in Richmond who just sets the house on fire, right? And so she's like, I'm just going to set this place on fire.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that in the testimony, her enslaver, who's a woman, says, I just never had any trouble from her. I don't know what has gotten into her, why she would do that, right?
Yeah.
And so she's coming after having strolled around the neighborhood to meet with some friends and visit with acquaintances, and she sees the place on fire. And the woman has the keys to the house, has access. And the woman's like, give us the keys. And she was like, I don't know what you're talking about. What keys, right? And so she appeared, the record says she appeared very much confused.
I think you just,
Right.
I think it describes like her not being able to find buckets for water all of a sudden.
Yeah, and so everyone tries to get buckets. Neighbors come around. They're trying to put out the fire. They're grabbing buckets, and they're like, "Come on, grab a bucket." And again, the record says she appears very much confused, right? And so it's moments like that, right, where she sets the place ablaze. And she sits there on the stoop. They literally in the record, they're like, she's sitting on the stoop, right? And she's very much confused. But I think that we can infer, particularly because, now she's also on her person has like some stolen stockings and some money, a couple of outfits.
Right.
I imagine that she was on her way out. Like she was ready to go make her move to the Union lines and claim her freedom, right? And so it's moments like that that you begin to see sort of the active participation of enslaved women in a place like Richmond, right, which is at the heart of the Confederate government, right? And it's in the city, right? So it's certainly causing an uproar. And it's a reminder to people in the Confederacy that there are enemies among us, right? And as much as you'd like to deem them chattel property, they are very much politicized.
Yeah, and there's a part I think around that section in the book where you talk about sort of descriptions of enslaved women who had escaped, and some that give these sort of very slight glimpses into the sorts of personalities and lives they might have had, sort of saying, well, she'll probably fit in pretty well in, you know, in the city or something like that, so she's probably there, in these sort of, you know, advertisements to try to capture her. But they're
Yes.
giving these like brief glimpses into lives that we learn so little
Yeah.
about otherwise. I found that really fascinating.
One of my favorites is an enslaved woman who leaves, and the enslaver describes her as, you know, wearing a red bodice, and she got a blue bonnet on, and she's got a ribbon, satin ribbon, and that, you know, she has a sharp tongue, and worst of all, she's a Methodist. And she loves singing hymns, and she might burst out into a hymn, but then also, you know, give you a tongue lashing in the same sentence, right? And so you begin to see their personalities, and he's like, she's gonna try to hire herself out as a free person, right? And so they can see right under their noses, right, that these people, right, have very, very clear ideas about who they are, who they want to be, right, and what they need to do in order to realize that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess that leads me to a question about sort of working in the archives and finding these stories, and what it's like for you sort of finding these very minimal, sketchy stories of these women and girls and sort of putting them together into a narrative where in many cases you're just drawing from sort of court records or these things that only give a glimpse into the criminalized parts of them. What is it like for you sort of putting these stories together into a more complete picture?
I try to be transparent about it, right? And so when I don't have enough information, I just say that I don't have a lot of information.
Right.
But here's what I think might have happened. And I think that's my opportunity to invite the reader also to provide their interpretation of what they think might be happening as well. And then there's also just, you know, years of reading and studying and thinking about sort of how you understand communities of enslaved people, the nuances, the politics, right? The ideas that flow within and outside of these communities is absolutely important. And so I think being clear about the kinds of questions that you're coming to the archive with, I think really shapes what you get out of it. I'm not the first person to look at these court records. Many historians have looked at these court records and have arrived at very different interpretations. And I came to these court records less interested in sort of the origin stories of the American legal system or the degree to which judges were invested in the idea of justice. And I was very much interested in what these enslaved women and girls thought about justice and how they navigated it, even in its sort of narrow parameters, and how we might even today think of them as people who are expanding the intellectual scope and reach of what justice could be.
So I'm going to ask you a last question that will come back to sort of the title of the book, which you've talked about a little bit. But yeah, what does the title, The Demands of Justice, mean to you? It seems like there's sort of a double meaning. I see the phrase come up in sort of from the side of the courts and the legal system, but obviously it also means these women and girls responding to a sense of justice and what that demanded of them. So I'm curious if you could expand on that.
Yeah, it's absolutely that, right? There are competing ideas about what justice should do, who should have access to it. But on a more personal note, I wrote this book during the pandemic, and I wrote the book during the time when we began to see protesters protesting and declaring that Black Lives Matter. And when many of us were protesting, I kept looking around and thinking about, why are we out here? You know, what are we doing out here? And a lot of what I began to think through is that many of us were out there protesting because there was something insufficient about the justice system, and there was something about the kind of justice that we were seeking that was not yet realized in the system as it exists. And so this idea of the demands of justice is a phrase that I think continues to carry us through a broader Black liberation struggle that began when we landed here, and that continues even today.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. I think we will turn to audience questions now. So There are microphones here. Please raise your hand. I'll call on you and wait for the microphone to reach you, please. Anybody want to kick it off? Did you see someone? Yeah, sorry, I missed you.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. Your book sounds just really just exciting, and I'm thrilled to get a chance to read it.
Thank you.
And I'm so interested in the way in which these enslaved women and girls can help us to expand what justice actually is, how it can take shape through the law or exceed the law. And a lot of your examples, at least from what we've heard, seem to be like individual women. And I'm wondering if you saw any moments of people working together, or any kind of, either emerging from community or even just a few people together, and whether that sense of justice was something that emerges from them kind of in a sort of commonality, or whether you read it out later. Does it differ from when people are acting in a more individual way? So just wanted to ask about that.
No, that's a great question. Thank you for that. In the late 18th century in Virginia, there was an enslaved woman who was pregnant and fully pregnant. And an enslaver was beating her repeatedly. And another enslaved woman came to her defense and then beat him. And then they both beat him. And that is one of my finest examples of collective resistance among women. And I think it's important to illuminate, right, that this sense of injustice and what is right and what is wrong is shared, right? It's shared and it's understood. And there comes a point, right, where people say, you know what, enough, right? They have their individual grievance with an enslaver, but they also collectively, right, show up for each other in ways that are really important. In the insurgency chapter, there was an enslaved woman whose biological father continued to rape her and would tie her to a block in front of his house and have other enslaved people hold her down. One day, all of them, everybody involved, right, even the ones who were holding her down, rose up and they beat him to death, and then they lit him on fire, right? And so even people who have been forced to be complicit, right, in that kind of violence also experience a sort of victimization through that violence, right? And then collectively through that experience, that traumatic experience, right, that was recurring every day. One day, all of them just decide, like, today's the last day, right? And so we definitely see incidences of sort of collective resistance throughout the book, and that are really important for how we understand sort of these local economies of justice, right?
More questions? Judalyn could go first.
Thank you very much for this wonderful work. I have two questions. The first question is about your sense of whether these cases involved any possibility of false accusations, meaning reading it from this historical distance. I know that they were all convicted, it sounds like. I haven't read it as yet, but I'm assuming that. So I just wondered if you had any sense of whether, there's any way of discerning whether these women were falsely accused at points. And secondly, and this is really my more interesting question, typically, we make appeals to our rights when we have a sense that we have rights. And then when we don't, we make appeals to mercy. I'm thinking about Bryan Stevenson's book, Just Mercy. And I wonder how, if at all, prominent a theme it is as you look through this historical material.
Yeah, that's a great question. So to your first question about false accusations, oftentimes an issue of clemency would be granted and they might return back to their enslaver. And this was very typical, particularly in instances involving poison, for the reasons that we mentioned, right? There are some medicines that they would give children that a doctor would prescribe. And because the enslaved girl was charged with administering the medicine, she took the hit for it, right? And they realized that this kid had been sick before, and they were, previously prescribed this medicine. And so oftentimes poison is particularly hard to prove, and oftentimes just a symptom of living in the 19th century, right? And then for your second question about whether or not this is really kind of rights-oriented, or is it about a broader conception of mercy? And I do think that twofold, right? From the jurist's perspective, the idea of mercy and it existing in a slave society is important for them to demonstrate that it exists, particularly because this is a young nation professing to have these egalitarian ethics and values, and everybody else is watching and saying, but what about slavery, right? And then on the front of the enslaved women, they're not making claims to rights. Oftentimes, right, this idea of mercy and this idea of even-handedness is something that they hope to be able to expect, right? And so oftentimes they're brought to these actions because of really these really visible and very sort of dramatic manifestations of cruelty. And so, many of the enslaved understand what slavery is, but when they've been brought to their limit, right, they're calling upon higher epistemologies of justice that have very little to do with the legal system and more to do about an intellectual concept, right, and a value around justice that they share.
Hi, thank you so much. Okay. Thank you so much for your work and for your talk. I wanted to just ask you about the cases that you describe and just the way that you're defining justice through these kinds of smaller actions, even though they're violent, but they're actions that diverge from the kind of politics of justice that we see in uprisings and rebellions and kind of armed resistance, which is also happening in the North and in certain abolitionist circles. And so I'm wondering how, in dealing with these different kinds of actions, if that is specific to how you're understanding gendered forms of resistance, or if you're kind of thinking about, the sort of what we think about when we typically think about resistance to slavery, in a kind of broader political sense, if that makes sense.
I think I'm understanding your question. To what extent are their actions gendered? Are you asking?
Yeah, and just, thinking about these types of, violence, like these forms of violence, alongside a kind of broader communal form of resistance, such as uprising, or again, kind of militant sort of formation underneath the surface of plantation life.
Got it. Yeah. I mean, I don't see their actions as particularly militant. And even the idea of violence is not necessarily a term that is plays a big role in what I'm trying to look at. What I really am interested in, because oftentimes this is the sort of the first time these women ever engage in violence, right? Oftentimes they're brought to the brink of acting in ways, and the court record always says, right, like that's out of character, or right? And so in this sense, I think it's really important to hone in also, in addition, right, to violence and sort of thinking about the reverberations of uprisings and sort of the tensions that are brewing on the ground. I think it's also important to think about the moral economy of right and wrong that had been developed and conceptualized by the enslaved. Because it helps us to understand so much more, right? So by the time we get to the American Civil War and we ask the question of who freed the enslaved, well, it's the enslaved, right? They've always wanted to be free, and they decided that before, the firing at Fort Sumter, right? And so there's all this thinking and there's all this values making among Black people that happened before the Emancipation Proclamation, that happened before the abolitionist movement, right? That have been very much a part of their sort of ongoing longue durée struggle in the United States. Does that make sense?
Thank you so much for discussing your research with us. It was such a privilege. I found the descriptions of enslaved women during the acts of violence really interesting, and how these descriptions not only speak to women's violence, but also racialized stereotypes of the period. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned how the enslaved woman who set on fire her enslaver's home appeared very much confused. So I was wondering if you could speak to these gendered and racialized stereotypes and how they were used against enslaved women in courts of law.
Absolutely. I think this becomes particularly acute in instances of murder and also infanticide, right? That there are certain ideas around the propensity for criminality and violence that are ascribed to Black women. And in that sense, crime becomes very racialized. But oftentimes we forget that what constitutes a legal crime is also racialized, right? And so what is an act that is committed by a Black woman may not be deemed a crime if it's committed by a white woman or a white man, right? And so these contradictions are not always accounted for in these sort of hyperbolic, sensational descriptions of who these women are and what they did in the newspapers, right? And so oftentimes when I'm looking at the newspapers, we get very sensationalist accounts that begin to craft these stereotypes around sort of violent Black women, right? These violent enslaved women. Also, when in infanticide, right? This idea of Black women as unfit mothers, or how could a mother do that? And so it's this tension between her duty is to protect her child, right? And to have this sort of ethos around motherhood, and yet you deny her, right, the right to become the mother that she wants to become, right, because of slavery. And so the onus, the responsibility, the moral onus is always going to be on the Black woman, even as she is dealing with these layers of stereotypical assumptions that are made about her. And that's why I think clemency became an interesting avenue to explore these cases, because petitioners would say, actually, there are other circumstances around this case that you all should know about, right? And so clemency becomes an important avenue for understanding the broader context of what led them to the court, right? And how they arrived at the court. And I say that because some women didn't do right on what they were accused of doing or what they were charged with doing, but then some did, right? And so how do we begin to understand beyond the stereotype what led them to that particular action, right? What led them to the courts to begin with. So those stereotypes are absolutely there, and they're definitely in the newspaper accounts, right? Because they want to generate subscribers, and they want to be able to be the first to discuss what happened, on this particular farm. And that's also what leads petitioners to petition, right? They're like, wait a minute, Fairfax County is not what you think it is, right? And so there's all of these sort of very contentious claims as to really what happened and who these people are.
Thanks. All right, over here.
I'm piecing this together and was thinking about it with what you just said. So you also mentioned Beloved by Toni Morrison. And I know at least today we're very much a culture that thinks a lot about crime and justice, and also is very excited by it, I think, when I'm thinking about a lot of true crime podcasts and things. And I'm wondering if, when you were working on this book, you found a story that maybe had been sort of so passed on or mythologized in American history that you didn't realize you'd seen it or heard it before, either passed down or maybe in a product, like a fictional story, or apart from Beloved, a fictional story or a movie or a TV show or something like that, where you realize oh my gosh, I know that story.
Actually I haven't. I think that You know, I talk a little bit about Margaret Garner, who Toni Morrison writes about in Beloved, but a lot of these stories actually, I've seen here and there that historians have thought about, but not necessarily from the perspective of the enslaved. And so I'm hoping actually that by me writing this book and showing where these sources came from, that more scholars will go back and revisit those cases and write more about them, because I'm not going to have the definitive say on any of this, right? And so the idea is to generate a conversation, and my hope is that more and more scholars would engage with this source base further, because it hasn't been sort of popularized in ways that you might imagine. And then even in terms of Margaret Garner, I think that Toni Morrison really sort of took that story and made it a life of its own in ways that I think that have been very intellectually generative as well, right? And so fortunately, I don't think that these cases have been mishandled or even have been so popularized that they lose, right, their meaning and substance and sort of what we can glean from their lives, right? But hopefully, you know, more people will carefully engage, you know, with these stories.
Thanks. Well, I think we are out of time, and we're going to have to close it there. Thank you so much for attending. Thanks so much to those of you watching online. There will be a book signing and sale in the room back there for those of you here in person to read more about these stories. Please, for those in person, fill out your survey cards if you can and return them to us. And once again, thank you so much for being here, and thank you to Tamika Nunley. This was fantastic.